Good evening. Okay, so I think we're ready to begin. Yeah? Okay. So, thank you all for coming tonight on this balmy February Thursday. So, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Carie Penabad, who, along with her partner Adib Carie, who's convalescing in Miami from an undisclosed injury, is this semester's William H. Bishop Visiting Professor. Actually, Davenport Professor, sorry. Past Davenport professors have included Frank Gehry, Greg Lynn, Francis Carie, Pierre Vittoriarelli, and Anupama Kundu. Last semester's professor was Kim Holden. So this is Carie and Adib's second visiting professorship at Yale. In 2013, they led a memorable studio working with students in Havana as the Louis Kahn visiting assistant professors. So they graduated to a full professorship. It was then that we were able to forge a friendship. So I'm very pleased on a personal level that they are back with us this semester. And it was a year before, in this room, practically 11 years ago to this day, that I first met Carie. And we were sitting up there next to each other in the Is Drawing Dead symposium that George Knight and Victor Agran organized. And I was quietly freaking out as I was about to moderate the closing conversation between Marion Weiss, Greg Lynn, Scott Cohen, and Michael Graves, the ingredients of a total disaster. So just 10 minutes, I don't know if you remember this, after our initial introduction, Carie could read my anxiety, or at least I thought she could, and without saying anything, calmly reassured me everything's going to be okay. Rational, receptive, and responsive, that was Carie in the moment. And if I'm to add another R word, rigorous, it also for me characterizes the work of CÚRE PENABAD. Dedicated educators, Carie is professor of architecture and Adib, associate professor of practice at the University of Miami. In practice, CÚRE PENABAD has worked across an expansive disciplinary framework, drawing equally from the ancient and the contemporary, disintegrating the distinction between object and fabric, and fluidly fostering the communal and in contexts both rural and urban. The rigor and the rational are self-evident in the work, but they are present as method rather than as predetermined and self-referential outcome. Responsive to climate and culture and receptive to the poetics of the everyday, their work is open and generous. Whether in Miami or in Guatemala, CÚRE PENABAD's work transcends its national setting to stitch together a regionalism that feeds off its contained diasporic energy. So in 2020, CÚRE PENABAD received the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League. They've been recognized with over a dozen AIA awards from the AIA, or for the Miami and Florida chapters. Their architecture has been published internationally in journals including Domus, Architectural Digest, and Architectural Record. Additionally, they have developed a body of drawn work that has been widely exhibited and awarded in its own right, some of which I'm sure we'll see tonight. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Carie Penabad, who will deliver the lecture, More with Less.
Thank you, Sunil. That was one of the most thoughtful introductions, and I think it is emblematic of a school like Yale. This is a very special community that we feel privileged to be a part of. And I guess I would first like to start by thanking Dean Burke, who happens to be in Miami, actually, today, and most especially Dean Bald for the invitation to teach at Yale this semester, and to the faculty, students, and staff of the Yale School of Architecture who have made us feel so welcome. Special thanks should also go to Deborah Garcia, who's been a fantastic collaborator, and we've enjoyed working with her tremendously. I will disclose that Adib's was an unexpected shoulder surgery that occurred over the holidays, which I can get to cocktail, but he's recovering and he really regrets not being able to be with you tonight. So more than a lecture, I really was hoping to share the story of our practice and some of the central themes that guide our work. The work that I will be presenting tonight is the collective effort of a talented team of individuals without whom the work of the firm would not be possible, and to them we're immensely grateful. In preparing for this presentation, I came across the following quote: "Designing means working with one's biography. One does not always see things as they are. One sees them through the person that one is." So I began to reflect on how our own biographies and personal histories weigh in on our attitudes towards architecture and practice. Both Adib and I come from the Caribbean, and our ancestry lies in the colonial cities of Cartagena de Indias and Havana and Santiago de Cuba, respectively. These historic cities that are perched on the sea were built with the porous oolitic rock that shapes this region of the world, and this material reality is made manifest in the architecture, with its thick, heavy masonry walls and its layers of porches and shutters that both protect and filter from the intense tropical light. This assemblage, seen here, and even today, amidst the fragile and unstable political situation of the region, displays the permanence of these elements and the effect that weight and solidity imbues these cities with. By contrast, Miami, where we have spent much of our adult lives, is a very young city. With a little over 100 years since its founding, Miami lies in a precarious line between the sea and the swamp. Largely built after the Second World War, Miami has replaced most of its historic architecture, and in turn, it's erased much of its origins. Today, it is feverishly building itself, an expanding contemporary city along Biscayne Bay that's defined by an architecture of thinness, with glazed and stuccoed buildings that are sealed off from much of the environment that defines this often magical landscape. In many ways, Miami is a discontinuous city whose constant search for the new produces an amnesia about the past. Could it be that displaced from our own origins and witness to the effects of time on these historic cities versus our own, we've always been drawn to search for what is fundamental and resonant in architecture, those elements that have the capacity to withstand the test of time? Our search for origins is guided by a process of distillation that seeks to reduce a work of architecture to its most fundamental aspects. As in the process of making wine, distillation extracts the essential characteristics, resulting in an outcome that could not be further reduced without being compromised. Some of our most powerful encounters with a search for origins in architecture have come through our study of vernacular architecture throughout the world, both at the scale of a building or at the scale of the city. According to Webster's dictionary, the term vernacular refers to the use of a language or a dialect that is native to a region or a country, rather than a foreign language. The vernacular is always linked to the particulars of a given culture, and yet, what does this mean today when we coexist in a globally interconnected world? Interestingly, the vernacular has always moved between the local and the global. The vernacular addresses the basic human need for shelter and enclosure through fundamental architectural responses that are not guided by novelty, but by wisdom, the wisdom of the ages transmitted through architectural form and made manifest in the timeless elements of the floor, the wall, or the roof. In so doing, certain formal architectural expressions have arisen in regions that share similar cultures or climates despite never having developed alongside one another. How might we explain this? Perhaps we can refer to it as architectural common sense. Should we not raise our buildings when they are set on wet ground? or consider steeply sloped roofs in regions where it rains or snows incessantly. We believe that the vernacular is not only limited to a historical past, but it is a generative grammar that incorporates modern buildings and cities as well as the byproducts of mass culture. So for us, the vernacular includes the urban patterns that define informal settlements, such as this one, Las Flores, along the northern coast of Barranquilla, Colombia, or the historic rural Cuban bohío, built from the natural materials of the surrounding landscapes and meant to weather alongside it. Or even the contemporary Tokyo pencil building type, which is unique to Tokyo, producing unbelievably thin urban buildings that are directly extruded atop of the historic platting of the city, thus registering the urban grain of the origins of the place. In the end, the vernacular, both historically and also as part of contemporary culture, epitomizes the theme of distillation, as it searches for fundamental forms that always do more with less. And it is perhaps this interest that brings us to the search for simplified, distilled forms in our own work. Many of the projects that I will be presenting here tonight rely on simple geometric forms for their architectural expression. This formal output is the result of multiple and complementary forces that act on the work, often resulting in the development of an architecture of restraint, where the range of materials and compositional moves are limited to a few carefully selected elements. The work is centered on the timeless building of cities and displays a commitment to the production of a whole that is always more than the sum of the parts. Tectonically, the work consistently develops an architecture of wall, often searching for an illusion of thickness where none exists, and drawing upon the traditions of a region, both in Miami and throughout Latin America, where the wall and not the skeletal frame is viewed as the primary means of architectural and structural expression. Seen in its totality, the work emerges from an understanding of architectural tradition that we believe is interpreted in its broadest and maybe most holistic sense. It emerges from the notion that the discipline of architecture has a language and a grammar of form making, and that a contemporary practice can participate in a broader lineage or a connection to the origins of a distant past without the feelings of an anxiety or nostalgia. So when Adib and I completed graduate school at Harvard, we went on to work at the Boston-based firm of our professors, Rodolfo Machado and Jorge Silvetti. Their model of practice appealed to us as they straddled the academic and the professional worlds. And several years later, we were fortunate enough to embark on our own journey in a similar path when we returned to Miami to take on teaching positions at the University of Miami School of Architecture and to start our own practice. Miami, as you see here, is at the center of the map. From the Northeast, Miami is often viewed as a province, albeit an incredibly desirable province post the pandemic. And when seen from Latin America, it's a capital. So the city is either at the edge or at the center, depending on your frame of reference. And as such, it's a place that is continuously reinventing itself. The first projects that we worked on in the city, which I will briefly show you, were varied, and they took place in very different urban settings. We worked in the heart of suburbia, but we also worked within the historic Garden City. And finally, we worked within what could be described as the new city. All are distinctly different contexts that make up the complex patchwork of neighborhoods that define Miami. So this is the media image that is projected for Miami. It's an aerial view of the historic Art Deco district at dusk, with Biscayne Bay and the high-rise developments of downtown and the Brickell financial districts in the distance. It's an alluring and attractive city with a dense urbanism that creates a vibrant urban environment for locals and tourists alike. And in about 48 hours, our students will be walking these streets. And yet, most of Miami looks like this. And this is not the Miami that you will arrive to if you're a tourist. It's a city that dramatically expanded following World War II with an urbanism that was largely designed for the car. So our first project took place in the heart of suburbia, just south of what is a primary road that goes from downtown, or the heart of downtown, all the way to the Everglades. And we were posed with the challenge. We had a client who had an extremely limited budget, and we also were given a less than extraordinary site, and we were challenged to create a kind of warehouse to house, at the time, 3,000 men's suits. We took on the job because you don't get that many breaks in the arts. So you take what you can and you run with it. And so we found sort of confluence with the client, and we looked at the surroundings and decided to build upon these kind of elements that exist in this local vernacular and figure out if we could find a way to recompose it. So this is one of the first sketches that we produced, where you will see this kind of taut box with the one depression at the entry and a very large sign that is running perpendicular to the building because of its displacement from the main road. This was the executed sign that was done in the evening, and it was the only one that had a kind of pink light so that it could be readily seen from the highway. But then this section, I think, best describes our intentions, which quite simply sought to kind of reverse the basic urban patterns of the neighborhood. And so we placed the building at the front of the site, something that seems, quite ordinary in a place like New Haven, but kind of extraordinary within a suburban landscape. And we decided to hide the parking at the rear of the property. More importantly, when seen against the existing context, we wanted to produce an interior that was in sharp contrast to the relentless 8'6", kind of acoustical tiled ceiling, dark air-conditioned interiors, and produce a double height volume that would be naturally lit and could be a kind of juxtaposition to the surrounding fabric. At the back, there's a small kind of tailor shop and the office for the owner. So this is a diptych that represents the front and the rear with these vernacular elements kind of recomposed, the taut stuccoed walls, the kind of depressed opening that serves the porch, serves almost like a porch to protect you from the incessant rains of the area. And at the rear, you see the kind of kit of parts with the casement windows, the downspouts, and even the asphalt parking that was in this case colored and kind of reconsidered as another kind of surface that we could play with. This is an interior, and then finally a view from the road at night where it stands amidst all of its suburban neighbors. Sort of simultaneously with that, we received another call to work on a completely different project, which was a modest one. It's a restoration to a single-family house in one of Miami's most beautiful historic districts, which is Coral Gables. And this is the 1920s city. And what you have to keep in mind is that Miami has very little historic architecture, and what remains is really under threat by extreme development pressures. We believe that the richest cities find ways to both grow while preserving the vestiges of a past that connects us to our history, and this is the reason that we took on the project. The scale and the scope is extremely modest, as I mentioned. After all, it's the restoration of a single dwelling. And here, unlike the previous project, we sought to research and restore. Our goal was to really become anonymous and simply bring the house back to life. This is not something that you are often taught to do in schools of architecture. At least we weren't taught to do this, because the desire is to always make your mark, to really leave your signature. And this project taught us that not all projects are intended to do this. And when restoring historic buildings, particularly in a place like Miami, a more discreet and even silent hand can be more powerful in the long run. The third of the early projects is in the new city. And it was for a developer that founded the Design District, which is an 18-block area of the city just north of the downtown, and was developed largely, as I mentioned, by a single developer, which is a phenomena that now is quite common in Miami. Originally, we were commissioned to create a very small kiosk for an empty lot that was in the neighborhood. However, we felt that the site had far greater potential. Miami has a dramatic lack of public open space. In fact, we have significantly less public space per inhabitant than comparable cities like New York or Boston. And of course, this is not surprising because, as most of you know, the city was developed after the war where the private backyard eclipsed the collective spaces of gathering. Given this reality, we felt that we could expand the brief and try to create the first public space for the neighborhood. This was the existing site, which was a parking lot, a paved parking lot in the design district, but it had the last stand of mature oaks that historically crossed through the district. And so our goal was to really reframe and preserve this, this vestige of a natural hammock and figure out a way to transform it into the neighborhood's first public space. For the sake of the presentation, I'm just going to focus on the plaza at the lower part of the image. And what we tried to do was, in fact, quite straightforward. We were presented with the backs and the side of adjacent buildings. And for anyone who has been in great public spaces, they need frontages, essentially. So we managed to work closely with an arborist and slipped a building that was essentially an L with a thin retail program and a loggia at the rear. More importantly, we upended all of the asphalt and found a way to convince the developer, I'm not quite sure how, to do kind of 3-inch thick oolitic rock, which is a beautiful rock of the region. And it is the rock that was used in a lot of the early public spaces in the city. It's a beautiful stone that not only connects us to our geology, but weathers gracefully in time to create a kind of carpet for the space. So this was the building just about a week after it was executed with that kind of carpet of oolitic rock and then the kind of framing of that L piece that I talked to you about. We covered the walls of the space with a series of tiles that were influenced by our travels throughout the tropical world, where the colored surfaces were able to withstand the bleaching rays of the sun and cleanse themselves after the harsh weather and rains. The murals for us also elaborated on the themes of art, display, and design that are characteristic of both the design district and later the adjacent Wynwood neighborhoods. At close glance, the tiled surfaces oscillate with a play of light and dark under the tree canopy and allowed us to incorporate a dim yellow-colored light closer to candlelight in order to connect us to the light levels associated with some of the most beautiful public spaces we've been in, and maybe in sharp contrast to the quality of almost like parking lot light that happens in the Miami public spaces. This was the space soon after it was completed, and about 7 years ago it was demolished. And if you go to Miami now, and our students will see it, the Hermes flagship store now stands at the corner of the design district. And, it might be easy to demonize the developer on this, but I think what this showed us is that Miami's building most of its public spaces now by the private developer. And while the private realm has a role to play, and we can see many examples in history when public and private developments come together to build the collective spaces of the city, we can't rely on the developer because this is ultimately private land, which when the development trends take force, make these spaces very vulnerable and we lose them. So soon after, we were kind of building some momentum in building a practice, and then we were hit by the recession. Let's see if I can get this to work. And we turned south. Okay, I can't. Let's see. I'm going to try this one more time. Okay, we'll forward then. Oh, here we go. So it doesn't have sound, so I'll just talk over it. But basically, like many offices, we were a small office, and when the recession hit, we were hit pretty badly. And what we learned in this case is if you want something that you don't have, you usually have to do something you haven't done. And so we jumped on a plane at an invitation to go to design a workshop, and that experience really changed the direction of our practice. We were able to meet some extraordinary clients, which commissioned us to do this building that you see here. This is our version of a high-tech animation. But in any case, the physical model became important for us because we had to travel back and forth between Guatemala and Miami. And I would say in a hyper digital world, which I think is a powerful one, we found in our own work that the physical model has always been a transformative moment in projects, oftentimes saving projects or allowing clients to believe that the projects are possible. And so this is what this model did for us. I might just let it play because I just love it when the little screws come back to the box. It looks like it's like they're being pulled by a magnet. Okay, I'll leave it there. So in any case, we started working in Guatemala. Neither Adib and I are from Guatemala. Guatemala is an extraordinary country with an unbelievable people and unbelievable geography. And we got to work in the southern coast of the city next to the Pacific. And we were charged by the client to design a new corporate headquarters for a sugar mill. And the brief called for a single building that could offer a collective space of gathering, because up until that point, the departments had been divided across a landscape that didn't allow them to communicate to one another. And so their creative capacity and ability to communicate was limited. So what we did is we developed a almost industrial footprint, because again, we were working, once again, we have yet to develop or work on a project with unlimited budgets. I feel like I should speak to some that are in the audience that probably have larger budgets than we have, but nevertheless, it was a singular building, and from left to right, it has a theater building or a kind of auditorium to the left that was directly modeled on Rudolph Hall. The sizes of it and the dimensions. We think this is just an extraordinary cave-like space, and we love it. And then there's a break in the building, and then the majority of the building is a series of repetitive rooms, conference rooms that oscillate with open courts, a very large communal space at the center. And the break in the building was strategically done. This is a site where you can see an extraordinary volcanic landscape. And for us, the context obviously is not just the immediate context, but it's that longer distanced view of the volcanoes that are hundreds of miles away. So this is the Volcán del Fuego that you can see through the framed Belvedere and kind of draws it into the building. And what's amazing about this volcano is that it's always active. So it somehow puts you in touch with your own mortality when you see it in the distance. But we also recovered the original mill or sugar mill, and we cleaned it up and we set it in the entry to sort of remind the company of its past and, you know, its growth. We produce drawings like this. We do a lot of drawing in the office. I think Adib and I are the last generation that was principally taught by hand or worked by hand, and then where the computer came in graduate school. So we produce these hybrid drawings, and I want to say that this is not a colonialist conceit. I mean, this actually happens. They march into the fields on El Día de la Virgen del Rosario to kind of announce the beginning of this cycle. And I think perhaps in America, we sort of tend to diminish ritual, but somehow it's very rich and real, and it's part of everyday life, and so we wanted to celebrate it. And so you see the building popping up from the horizontal landscape. This is a section of the building, which is self-evident, and then this is the building upon completion. Unfortunately, nobody had moved into the building yet, but it was the only time that we could photograph it, so there it is. We were able to work on all aspects of the building, from the interior finishes to even the furniture that we could actually produce locally. So it was an extraordinary moment of growth for us. This is a building that almost needs no electrical light. The light levels in the building work day well into the beginning, or at least close to sunset. And this is important for us because for us, sustainability, first and foremost, relies on common sense forms that are allowed to cross-ventilate and naturally light. And then anything that we can do with a kind of mechanized world is a kind of plus on top of it. I don't know if this is our own interest or just the fact that we work within contexts where the high-tech solutions are limited, in fact. And so we have to rely on the building form first and foremost. These are a few details of the building, where we were able to work directly with the craftsmen. Number of drawings, again, this is a very large-scale drawing that explores the narrative, as many of our drawings do. And finally, maybe two views, one at the end of the building that almost has a kind of projecting nose out of the dining room that has a framed view of one of the volcanoes. And then finally, a collective space, which is entirely outdoors. And that was a very interesting phenomena, because in America, you oftentimes have to work with the world of the drywall. But in Latin America, you can question those norms, work directly with workers on site. And in this particular case, it's a plastered exterior. It's really a concrete interior and exterior, so it's allowed to weather over time. And in this particular case, offers a counterpoint to some of the other views with a very long horizontal span that frames that timeless and beautiful landscape. This is the building, which for us was always a surprise. It looks just like the model, but that doesn't always happen, but it did in this case, so I was happy to see that. The second project we were, that building took us probably about 3 years from start to finish, going in and out of a country that we didn't really know well, and in so doing, we had to travel from the capital to the south, crossing a number of rural neighborhoods, and we realized that there were a number of communities near the site that we got down and we started walking through, and we came across this school relatively close to where we were working. And at the time, on a more personal note, I was the mother of an 8-year-old, and I walked into this classroom, and there were these 8-year-olds that were trying to, learn math. In like 100-degree weather, in like 8-foot ceilings, the acoustical panels were falling on their face. And I turned to Adib and I said, there's no way that this can happen. I mean, we've got to figure out a way to help. So, I don't think that as architects we can solve the challenges of, poverty in rural areas, but we can certainly try to create spaces that can contribute to making a better world for the small school, in this particular case, that we were exposed to. So we worked with a non-for-profit that was dedicated to promoting education in rural areas, and we developed a prototype for the school that could be kind of grown or shrunk depending on the needs. And we were hoping, if it was successful enough, could be used for other schools in the region. So Adib produced this sketch early on, named it Macondo. Any of you that are Gabriel Garcia Marquez fans, you'll know it's the beginning of the city in 100 years of solitude. And so it's really a kind of collection of buildings that occur under a lush landscape, which actually the site happened to have. It was one of its best features. So what we did is we started with the understanding of what the basic needs of the classroom was. We saw the classroom as the heart of the program. And then that module set a kind of kit of parts, and we figured out ways that we could arrange it both with enclosed spaces as well as porches, which in the tropical world can be used, equally to those of interiors, and sometimes even more desirably. We produce a section like this, and I guess it's a very fundamental resolution where we really wanted to lift the building from the ground, extend the roof as far as possible, bracketed it back to the building to almost kind of double the space that could be utilized. We sort of modeled the way in which the light moved across that simple building, and then we're able to execute it for the school. And so this is very low tech in the sense that this is a building that it has electricity, but it has no air conditioning. It has to rely on kind of cross ventilation. So the roof allows for the hot air to rise up and out of the building. There's no windows in the building, so all of it is a series of screens and louvers, to provide for various levels of opacity or transparency or ventilation. This is my favorite, I think one of my favorite images of the project, and we did this project pro bono because we had the opportunity to do it given the work that we were doing in the region. And that little boy is not old enough to go to school yet. His 3 brothers go to school in the building. But when we were on the site, he goes every day and he sits on that porch. So we approached him and we asked him, what he was doing there. And he responded that he loved being in the building, he loved being under the shade, and he loved listening to the classrooms. And I would say that that was the most profound interaction I had with anybody who's actually inhabited our buildings, because I felt in that answer, he felt seen, he felt dignified, he felt that somebody had cared enough to create a space that, would promote education, I guess, in this way, and in so doing could alter at least his day. So I think, the project gave us so much, taught us many, many lessons. This was the final image where the building was used the way that we had imagined with these outdoor spaces, and as a note, the school was able to double its enrollment and run classes in the morning and in the evening, and is continuing to grow today. So it's really been a gift, that project. So just to talk a little bit more about Guatemala, so we started with these projects, and then of course we built our network of individuals, and we began talking to other people. And contrary to its third world reputation among NGOs and missionaries, Guatemala is now considered a middle-income country in Central America, and barring a political catastrophe, which is altogether possible in Latin America, Guatemala will continue to grow in the decades to come. Now, the levels of extreme poverty are declining, and the fertility rate is also falling. Again, it's not perfect, but this typically accompanies growth in access to education. Guatemala's GDP per capita has also grown steadily over the past 60 years. And these statistics, they come from a variety of sources, but most notably the World Bank, and are supported by a rise of population to urban areas and a greater need for housing. So to date, we've worked on a number of housing projects in Guatemala. And the first one that I'll show you was the commission. They asked us to develop a new housing prototype, in fact, for an area immediately outside of the city center. So you could still say it's in a kind of quasi-suburban area. But nevertheless, the primary building type looks very much like the diagram. It's the long single-loaded corridor surrounded by parking, a sea of parking, where it's quite inhospitable. And so what we tried to do was say, okay, we'll take that basic form and we'll split it. And then we will do our best to figure out different ways to tuck the parking into the building so it isn't a sea of parking. And then we'll take these kind of requirements for green spaces, which are oftentimes left to the edges or the periphery, and find a way to incorporate them into the building. So we found a way to develop this as a prototype. And maybe one other thing that could be noted about this particular example is that we had to contend with a cultural phenomena of housing. And so when you work on housing and you work within a different context, there are these kind of cultural norms. And so what the owners told us is that the units don't want to touch one another. And we said, well, what does that mean? It's because you can't have a kind of shared party wall. So the challenge was to create a denser prototype, but where the units were not next to one another. And so what we did is we basically bifurcated the plan, creating units to either side, and had a pretty generous, I'm sure for those of you who develop housing in America, you'll see how generous that center core is, but it's a large public stair that allows for people to take and really kind of build a sense of community. So this is a typical view of one of the units, almost completed, where we were basically taking rather simple floor plans, but figuring out how we can layer space to make the views and the experience more expansive. And this is the building when it was executed with that stair that I mentioned earlier, and the kind of prototype building to the right. This is a view of the interior. Something that we learned in our travels throughout Tokyo is that when you have relatively small rooms, if you can provide larger windows, you know, the kind of experience of the room radically changes. So we developed a compartmentalized window system where all spaces are naturally ventilated as they're operable and give you these kind of expansive views of the landscape. Simultaneously with that project, we were presented with the opportunity to work with another client. And this was really at the beginning of the pandemic, ironically. And at first we thought it was going to really bring the project to an end. But what it did, surprisingly, is that it caused us to rethink the materiality of the project. Because in Guatemala, like many cities, the pandemic impacted the global supply chains of concrete and reinforced steel. And this reality led us to explore an alternative method of construction, which is, in this case, brick, which had been extensively used in Guatemala during the 80s, but had fallen to the wayside because it was tended to be more expensive, in fact, than the concrete and steel constructions. So we were incredibly excited at the possibility of building in brick, and we studied this basic prototype for a small house, in fact. And all of the dimensional criteria was directly linked to the sizes of the brick. And so this is the unit. And this is the first unit that was built. And once again, this is in an area adjacent to the city center, but not quite, cannot be really considered an urban environment. So we're still working in a kind of quasi-suburban environment. So what did we try to do here? We tried to reconfigure the plat to try to minimize the presence of the car. And then what we did is we took all of the required green space, and again, rather than just dividing it into sort of meaningless corners of the site, we brought it all together in the center to create a kind of a public space that could be shared by the community. You can see that here in the drawing. And these are the sort of typical floor plans for the unit. And all units had some way of exploring an outdoor garden space, which was important, you know, for our clients. And so here you see a kind of layering from left to right. It's a kind of garden that fronts the green, and then a kind of office space, which became important during the pandemic. And in this particular case, the vehicle is still, you know, critical in being able to move around the city, so it accommodates the cars at the rear of the property. The main space is one large open volume from beginning to end. And then obviously the third floor is for the bedroom. So this is some of the executed images of the project alongside some of the drawings that we produced. And one of the things we were able to explore here, again, is an outdoor space that is kind of monolithic. It has the same building material, and we tested the dimensional criteria of the brick and shifted it in different directions with the hopes that it would not only become a kind of extension of the living space, but would also participate in the public realm in front of it. These are a number of other additional drawings where we, you know, utilize methods of reusing the water, or in this case, the flat roofs were used for the solar panels. But this was a kind of moment that is an exception in the urbanism. It's the corner of the building where we were able to be more picturesque with the positioning of the windows based on the landings of stairs, as opposed to the more rational fronts of the building prototypes. This detail I just share with you because something what we learned in traveling in and out of Guatemala is that the light in Guatemala occurs, it's always directly overhead. So with very little projections on the surface, you get pretty dramatic shadows. And we wanted to figure out ways that we could move the brick around to be able to produce the effect that you see in some of these extraordinary civic buildings that the Mayans developed, and then which would of course later influence, you know, some of the decorative detailing of the deco buildings that we're more familiar with in Miami. And then finally, this is a project that is now finally taken hold and is being built. And so we're looking for ways to how to take that individual unit. And obviously there's a certain degree of repetition that must exist in housing, but how do we add enough variation that there is some level of specificity? This final project that we're working on in terms of housing in Guatemala is probably the most ambitious and slightly terrifying project that we're working on at the moment, because we've never done a high-rise before. But once again, you know, there's always a first. And so we're working on a high-rise building in Guatemala City. And this is a model of the building, and perhaps two guiding forces shaped the design. Probably one, the desire to create a recognizable figure for this building in sharp contrast to this anonymous sort of glass skyscrapers that surround it. And then also to try to reduce the number of elements, in this case repeating a kind of singular window to be able to, and changing its proportions in order to be able to, again, do more with less. And I'm going to just dwell here just briefly. I know oftentimes we hear that today in a digital world, the model dominates, and perhaps that is so, but I have to say that in our own practice, the plan is still a generator of form, and as James Ackerman once said, and in housing, we found it to be particularly important, the art of plan making, because it is there where you have to resolve the particulars of housing. And so this is a very compact plan where we've developed a compact core and 4 units, essentially, perhaps a little closer to the Palazzina type, that limits, you know, the amount of public space given over to circulation. And what this does, obviously, is it provides, you know, spaces of ample light and circulation of air. This is the figure of the building. Maybe of note might be that we were able to carve within this form a series of stacked public terraces that stay within the taut envelope, but provide a kind of unexpected section for the units. And then the drawings, again, which play an important role for us, not just to represent the project, but to work through the design. And then finally, a photograph of the model where perhaps you can see those preoccupations made most clear. So I would like to maybe end the presentation with new directions. And these are projects that are on the boards right now, but I thought would be interesting to share in the context of this presentation. And we were fortunate really during the pandemic to be, like probably many of you, part of the creative class. But we went out several days a week, Adib and I, and we would drive our city from one edge to the other. And somehow when home became the center of our lives, I think it became more evident the inequalities and really the housing shortages in Miami. These realities became more palpable. I'm sure you hear oftentimes about the climatic crisis of Miami and how the seas are rising. All of that is true, and if it rises to the degree that they say it will, it's likely that we will migrate, as many people have done before us. But what is a more impending crisis in the city is really the housing crisis right now. And so having driven through our city when it was much more quiet during the pandemic, we reached out to a number of people. And now that we had more projects under our belt because of the housing projects we had been able to develop in Guatemala, we had a certain degree of authority, and we could kind of try to figure out ways that we could work within the housing markets in Miami, which quite frankly, offices like ours seldom work in because usually these housing markets are dominated by large-scale developers. So the last three projects that I will quickly show you are in three developing neighborhoods in the city. When I say developing, is that they're historic neighborhoods, but they occurred to the west of the highway. And so currently they are experiencing what we're calling climate gentrification because they occur on the higher lands. They were also historically minority communities, either Black or Latin communities, that were west of the highways, and the highway, as you all know, cut through these communities and really severed them from the growth of the wealthier parts of the city. So we were contacted by a local developer who actually was a former student of ours, who actually went to Columbia to get a graduate degree in real estate and then opened up a development firm in Miami. So it's two young female developers, which is already pretty rare in the city. And they were hesitant to call us because they thought we wouldn't be interested in developing a very small parcel. When I say a small parcel, it's really the size of a residential parcel. It's 50 by 100 feet deep. And it's in the heart of Liberty City, which is actually the neighborhood, if some of you have seen the movie Moonlight, I don't know if you have, it's basically, it takes place in Liberty City. So we told them absolutely not. We were very, very interested. She had partnered, and we engaged in the project to try to develop an intermediate scale for housing in the city that could be more incremental and kind of rely on certain typologies that were really absent in the city today. She had partnered with this incredible organization called the Ladies of Hope Ministries. I'm not sure if any of you are aware of this, but they're based out of New York, and they actually build transitional housing for formerly incarcerated women. And it so happens that Miami has the highest rate of minority formerly incarcerated women in the country. Maybe that's not surprising. I mean, we just saw a map today in the studio where you can see the kind of demographics of the city, and it's 85% Latin. So, I mean, that could explain also the rates of minority incarceration. But regardless, it's an extraordinary organization, and they wanted to build their first building in Miami. So we studied the neighborhood, as we often do. We've searched through it, the areas that most people don't necessarily walk through, to see if there was anything that could be learned by it. And what we discovered is that most of the housing in this area of the city is similar to the one that you see up there, which probably in an aerial perspective looks like a very nice courtyard type, you know, and you might not be very critical of it. But when you actually move through this on the ground, you notice a number of things. It's got incredibly small windows, and obviously now they're gated because of the security issues. But what you'll notice is it has an exterior set of circulation. And because the circulation is on the inside, the public rooms oftentimes have very, very small windows because you're contesting with the public space crossing with the desire for privacy. So the spaces of these buildings are really quite dark and inhospitable. So we were given the challenge to design this corner lot, and this was an early sketch that we did because it's an open corner, and it would be an open corner indefinitely. We wanted to try to provide something that would make it kind of register. But in essence, what we produced was a prototype that could be developed for this lot, but in our minds could be developed all along Martin Luther King Drive. And quite simply what it does is that it pushes back on the current parking norms of the city, which we believe is critical if we're going to make any inroads with the housing situation. So it places a sort of micro retail shop at the entrance, conceals the parking at the rear. And the micro retail is actually part of Hope House, as they basically offer internships and opportunities for work for the women. So here you see an image to the right. And then the basic floor plan basically has 6 units, right? 2 units on the street side, which are usually the more desirable units. And then what we did is we inverted that kind of exterior corridor and we placed it on the inside of the building. And in doing so, we could push the units right adjacent to the courtyard, creating very, very large windows that could give you an effect like the one that you see here on the right. And then finally, the 2 units at the rear were also carved out with a courtyard, because what you have to understand is that eventually now with the city's codes, the city will grow up around here and this will become a party wall condition. So this was a view of the courtyard at the rear. And for any of you who are lovers of manteña, we usually give names to our drawings. So this is angels in the architecture, and we borrowed manteña's angels up at the top in the hopes that this project would actually happen. You never know, So these are some studies of the model where we were developing a more rational front against a more sculpted interior for the courtyard. And then finally, 2 kind of buildings where we were unfolding the elevations to study the different sides of the building and then presenting a kind of oblique view, which is where you would see the building along Martin Luther Drive. The blue, by the way, is the color of the building. And just anecdotally, we were given the color swatches of Martin Luther King Drive, and they were beige, medium beige, dark beige, brown, medium brown, dark brown, and blue. So we were like, okay, let's do blue. It rarely occurs in the natural world, and this is a project that would be pretty rare if we can actually get it built in Miami. So we thought we could choose the most unusual of the colors. This project is in Overtown. So if the highway, bisected a little river, or at least cut it off, I should say Liberty City, if it cut it off, really Overtown had the most extreme kind of relationship with the highway as it cut through it in both directions. And so working with the same set of developers, we are having the opportunity to actually develop, alongside a non-for-profit, the headquarters for Catalyst Miami. And Catalyst Miami is a non-for-profit that serves Overtown and wanted to remain in the community. And through a whole host of events, which are outside of the scope of this presentation, they were able to secure a parcel. And if we thought the previous parcel was small, it was 50 by 100, this one is 50 by 50. And you might say, well, there's nothing that could be done in a 50 by 50 in Miami. And most people think that's the case. Most people think that the only thing that could be built on that site is a detached single family residential. But because we visited other cities, certainly Tokyo being one of our favorites, we know that much more can be done on these smaller parcels. So working alongside a pretty inventive developer, we developed a new courtyard building type that houses the headquarters for Catalyst Miami, as well as a small retail shop at grade, and then 4 affordable housing units above that Catalyst will rent out to local artists that do internships in Overtown. And so again, a very, very compressed site. We had to do a lot of gymnastics with the codes and parking and a whole number of things to be able to execute this. But our hopes is that if we can get it built and it breaks ground this month, we will be able to at least show a different model for how the city could be built more densely, but also more incrementally. So these are a number of views where architecturally, this is, again, a code that will eventually come up to the building, making it really a party wall condition. So at the end of the day, what will remain is a kind of gridded, rational facade in facing the main boulevard. And so we spent a lot of time working through that, again, limiting the number of elements in order to create less with more, but knowing that at the end we would have a kind of billboard for the building that is almost a perfect square. And I just had to share that because I have an Achilles heel for the square, so what can I say? And then the final project, which is really, I hesitated on whether to bring it or not, but I thought it would complete the trilogy of projects, as this one is the most raw, and it's really on the boards, but it takes place once again in one of these neighborhoods west of the city center. And this case is more similar to the design district, quite frankly. So this is an instance where a single developer has amassed most of the property in the neighborhood and is now developing a new neighborhood. And so this is, the city gets its name, or the municipality gets its name, from a river that is at the north of the site that deposits onto Biscayne Bay. And what we're working on is the development of a half block area in Little River. And what has been interesting is that the plus for having large scales of the cities being developed by a single hand is they can offset certain requirements, and they can do things that sometimes the individual lot cannot. And so we did not have to meet the mandates of some of the parking and zoning requirements that might limit this type of development. So I say that because what we're hoping to do is to produce a new mixed use kind of courtyard type. And this is a paving pattern that we've developed for the property. And again, it's a sequence of repetitive units, a kind of head and tail. And the courtyards basically occur where there's a series of mature trees, which doesn't happen very often in this neighborhood, but in this particular parcel, it does. And so we looked to kind of strategically map the specimens that were the rare specimens and then create a series of courtyards. And our hopes in doing this is that we could, of course, densify the neighborhood beyond what it is. I mean, it's adjacent to the railroad. It's got an industrial strip to the north. And then directly behind you is a detached single-family residential neighborhood. So how do we transition from that neighborhood, which will likely be like that for the foreseen future, and then the larger scale buildings that are starting to be developed on the railway? This is a view of the kind of collection of buildings and a rendering that was produced of that courtyard that we think begins to express an idea of a more tropical urbanism, for lack of a better word, where you can get a series of buildings that are interspersed with a series of courts. And we've been working very, very closely with Land, a landscape architect in Miami, who's been working with us on this quite closely. And this is a final image of the project. And of course, it's an imaginary one. We were inspired by the paintings of Grant Wood, which you probably know best for American Gothic, but he does these unbelievable renderings of these kind of cross sections of the city. And so this, of course, is an imagined one, but where you can see the sequence of buildings and courts. And in the end, we hope that these projects represent an alternative and an optimistic vision for the city. They seek to address utility, but they aspire to delight, as we believe that it is this quality that is most evocative and aspiring, really, and perhaps with the desire to persist in time and space and memory, blurring the lines between the old and the new. Thank you. Sure. Anybody has?
There are a couple mics floating around for questions.
Thanks for the terrific lecture. Could you say a little bit more about your commitment to the wall, or to the appearance of a wall, perhaps?
Like why we do it? Oh. Well, I mean, I guess, as I alluded to in the beginning, I mean, Miami, unlike New Haven, I think still participates, tectonically anyway, in a language that is closer to Latin America, I would argue, than perhaps the Northeast. And so for us, the wall, from a tectonic standpoint, connects us to that tradition. But also, it's really the local vernacular, in a way. I mean, we build in concrete in Miami. And I thought it was interesting that Tatiana answered this, I think, at the end of her lecture, because oftentimes concrete is demonized. And, we talk about building in other materials, but the truth is that Miami still is a city that builds predominantly in concrete. So we are using the local vernacular and trying to express that. I think one thing I could say, though, is that the wall is used in Miami, but it's always used consistently in thin ways, right? It's the absolute thinness. And so maybe because of our own kind of interest in this kind of corporal architecture. I mean, I don't even know how to explain what draws us to it. We're always looking for ways to make it appear thick, even if it really isn't. And so we go through great lengths to try to do that. But I would say first and foremost, it's probably a cultural one, maybe also an economic one, and also, kind of tying it to the local traditions of the place.
Thank you, Carie, for a
Thanks.
fantastic lecture and beautiful work. The built work is so special, but the drawings are also enormously interesting, and they feel like the gift that keeps on giving. One can draw so much from them. I suspect even the drawer of the drawing. Can you talk a little bit about drawing practice in your work, and when you do things and what they're doing, what kind of drawings you use to do different things?
Yeah. So drawing is really very, very important to us. I mean, we principally draw by hand. So we still draw by way of analog. And a lot of the hand drawings that I think I showed today were actually produced by Adib. So he usually starts a project where he does very large trace drawings, and he uses oil pastels, and he basically will do a series of them basically by hand, and that's the way he thinks. He'll kill me if I tell you this, but he'll actually, if I walk into the studio and he has his shoes off, I know it's been a very productive day, because if he's drawing barefoot, it's like that means things have progressed. But so we still do a lot of drawing by hand, and we also do a lot of recording. But because we don't have an adversarial relationship with the computer in any way. In fact, I think when I first graduated from graduate school, I felt there was this desire that everybody wanted to forget about the analog drawing, and they wanted to embrace the kind of newness on the computer. And in a way, having stayed at it long enough, now I feel like the computer has just become the default. And so people are embracing either hybrid ways of drawing or embracing the analog, because somehow it's more autobiographical. I mean, for us, we just love to draw. We just enjoy drawing. So oftentimes we begin by hand. We work through the process of drawing by hand. And then we work with the team at the office, and we produce like hybrid drawings. And many times the patterns that we use for the drawings we produce them, right? So rather than taking them, we produce our own libraries of line work or patchworks or backgrounds, and we produce these by hand. And so it becomes kind of iterative. And then the narrative dimension of the drawing started to become more important when we had clients, ironically. And I know that's going to sound crazy, because you might think that the kind of narrative of a drawing would be richer when you were working in isolation. But somehow when we had to present the project to someone, when the drawing could have some meaning, and interestingly enough, when they can see themselves in it somehow. So we would even start incorporating, images like someone's dog. And it wasn't like perverse or anything, but it was just like, how do you get this person to fall in love with what you want them to do? And what you have to realize as an architect is that, we're not solely artists. I do believe great architects are artists, but we rely on clients to be able to execute our work. And so we have to be able to excite them and create emotion. And when you can build drawings that have narrative where the people can see themselves in it and their story in it, we found that they want to make it happen, because your drawings see a reality that they don't see yet. So I think the process is fluid. It has analog, it has digital. We build a lot of physical models still as well. So we just love to draw. I know it sounds like a very kind of simple thing, but we think through drawing, and we try to produce them, and we take a lot of time to do it. And then we sort of hope that the clients, I think what I've discovered is that when you care a lot about the image that you produce, that comes through, and then somehow the clients react to it, It doesn't always pay off, but it has enough times that it, seems worth it. But even if it didn't happen, it's worth it if you love doing it. So thank you for that, though, George.
Hi, I have a question about operating in international practice. I guess it's something that many architects want to do. Some made it, some didn't. I'm wondering, for your experience, what's the prerequisites or what's the challenges of operating a practice that transfers national and cultural boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it was a little terrifying. I'm not going to lie. But, you know, it didn't happen. We didn't set out. It was a little bit by chance, to be frank. So we were invited, and then if I was to be completely transparent, we ended up meeting some incredible individuals. I think what I realized is if you want to build a practice, you have to engage with individuals. If you don't want to do it, somebody in your office has to be able to do it with people that you can actually work alongside, clients, right? And so we had the opportunity to meet these extraordinary individuals in Guatemala. We had a connection, and they literally called us up maybe 3 months after, we kept connected to them. And they said, do you want to build a corporate headquarters in Escuintla, Guatemala? And we're like, what? And we're like, yes, because you have to figure it out, right? And so little by little, it took us probably 8 years to be able to set up an office in Guatemala. It wasn't instant. We were working mostly out of Miami, traveling to Latin America, but that wasn't a feasible model in the long run. So we had to build relationships on the ground, build a team, meet individuals, and slowly, about 8 years, it took us to establish the office there. So it's connections and kind of day-to-day work, and it takes time. Yeah.
Hi. I really appreciated how you mentioned using right here.
Oh, I didn't see. I saw your voice. It was coming from above, but
So I really appreciated sort of the acknowledgement and the use of the vernacular of both Miami and Guatemala. But I also appreciated how you sort of mentioned using the parking and challenging the status quo with parking. And I was just curious, how do you navigate that sort of thin line between embracing vernacular but also challenging what is the norm?
Well, I mean, specifically with parking, I guess, it is a vernacular in Miami, right? I mean, in a way. I mean, to specifically answer the question about the parking, I just think that form follows parking oftentimes, unfortunately. And then in Miami, if you're going to challenge the status quo, you're going to have to dive deep into, quite frankly, really pretty unsexy things like the codes, and figure out ways that you can find loopholes in them to be able to provide realities that now seem rare, but 40 years ago were just common sense, I mean, the city that we have today, the city that we live in, when I say we, I mean Miami, the majority of the city is the city after World War II. And we accepted that as a reality. But I think there's no reason why we can't reverse those trends, especially with the rates that transportation is being reconsidered. So to answer your question specifically, we just had to dive deep into and find creative ways to move through that code, which allowed us to then explore models that people didn't think were viable, but they were. So it takes more effort, it takes more time, and quite frankly, it takes more dedicated developers. I'm not one that demonizes the developer, quite frankly. We've had the opportunity to work with some extraordinary developers. But those projects that would normally take, 12 months have taken these developers 3 years. And what they're banking on is that they can produce something that isn't the normative condition, so that they can then set a standard that might change the norm. And hopefully it become a new vernacular, maybe. I don't know.
Thank you, Carie. First off, your work is as timeless as, there's a sense of place in your work that I really appreciate. But I wanted to ask you again about drawing, if I may. Partially because I feel that there is a lot of slippage between your drawing, the color palettes, and the work itself, which is unusual. But I wanted to ask you if you could somehow position your method of drawing and the drawings themselves, both biographically, but also in the discipline's history, because there's a moment that we abstract in drawing, and there's a moment that we stop abstraction in drawing. So So I wanted to see where you see your drawings fit in that kind of perspective, in that gradient.
You mean the degree to which we pursue abstraction, or the degree to which...
Pursue abstraction, they're rather decidedly painterly.
Yes. Yeah, that is true. That is true. We, I mean, I don't think we're the only ones to do this. Obviously, a school like this probably knows this very, very well. But yes, Adib specifically, myself tangentially, we do have art backgrounds. We did minors in art. We have a love of art and painting and composition. And I mean, we decidedly move away from the hyperreal drawing or the photographic drawing or the rendered drawing, not because we don't, we have a friend, and I'm staring at Nader next to us, a mutual friend, Rodolfo Carie, who's the dean of the University of Miami, and he makes a strong argument for the hyperreal drawing, the photographic image, because he tells me, well, Carie, it's in that image that you have to resolve everything. And then I say, well, but it looks so much like a photograph, in fact, that it's not an image that I'm capable of producing. Maybe it's because I don't have the skills. I don't know all these unbelievable softwares that you all know, perhaps, maybe I'm too lazy to learn them, but I don't think so. I mean, I think we have willfully chosen to do drawings that separate you from the hyperreal, if you will, or the photographic image as a way of dwelling on the drawing as a work in and of itself. However, having said that, because of our interest in place, which I appreciate in your question, I do think that there is a level of specificity that we choose. So it's not like we can choose a random person off of a database or a random tree or choose a color, any color, for instance. So I do think that the desire for the hyperreal might come in the selection of all of the elements of the drawing, even if the final rendition is more painterly, for lack of a better word. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but that's my attempt. And maybe I can answer it more over a mojito. Like, oh no, Nader. No.
Hello.
It's like, yeah.
A follow-up question. You describe the lecture in biographical terms.
Yeah.
But that's also a way of escaping the cultural underpinnings from which you emerge. So, and this may not be polemical at the end. It may be just a matter-of-fact response. But you emerge from the University of Miami. The presence of new urbanism and the many other cultures that permeated in that school produced a kind of culture. And I'm very familiar with that because of my former partner, Monica, who emerged from the same school. But we all actually build our practices with a kind of safe calibration in relationship to our mothers and fathers. Some of us reject it vehemently and we try to kill them, and others continue them in some way or another. So if I were to ask you from a more disciplinary perspective, how do you see, because a lot of your tropes, your adherence to symmetry, the romanticism of the images, they emerge from a very particular culture that are, one could say, completely natural to that culture, and yet equally anachronistic from other practices today. But I wonder, how do you position yourself when you see yourself in your own school? Is this a continuity of that school, or are there vast differences in terms of what you're doing and what the UM school achieved over many decades?
I mean, I don't know how many in the room would know the history, and we also share similar fathers. Certainly having Rodolfo and Jorge. I'm Latin, so I love my families, I don't know. I don't feel like the need to kill my father. So, hey, But I don't. I love my second cousins, my third cousins, a lot of other. I mean, I think that I'll just say one thing because I think that the room has been in here for a long time, and I think we would benefit from having a cocktail. But I will say one thing that I think from an outsider's point of view, the most recognized figures that have come out of Miami are Andres Juani and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg, and they are formidable. When I went to Harvard, I felt like I needed to be, and Nader, you were teaching at the time, and I was so fortunate to have you. But I felt like I had to be the defender of the new urbanists. You know, all of a sudden they were the ones everybody loved to hate, you know, and there I was. But quite frankly, my experience at Miami was quite different because I was trained by a generation of individuals that had come together at a very unique moment in the school's history. And they ultimately believed in architecture as a collective act where the city was first and foremost. But the expressions of that within the school were quite diverse, you know, much more diverse than you would think looking at it from the outside. So to answer your question, I mean, you know, I do believe in many of the fundamental tenets, but I think that the practice has evolved, you know, and is open-minded, I think. I don't think that we are dogmatic because we understand that our role within cities is messy and that not all cities deserve or need the same type of resolution. So I will say that I'm part of a lineage that I'm proud of and that I don't have to kill, but I'm hoping that I can provide some new chapters in that story. So thank you so much. Yeah.